one battle, one decision. Most people have never thought about it, but the outcome shaped everything that came after. Every time you pull your car up to a gas pump, you are part of a massive, invisible machine. That machine has a heartbeat, and that heartbeat pulses through a tiny, narrow strip of water on the other side of the planet. It is called the Strait of Hormuz. If you look at it on a map, it looks like a hook. It is the only way out of the Persian Gulf and into the open ocean. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only 2 miles wide. 2 miles of water. That is all that stands between the world's largest oil reserves and the nations that need them to survive. Every single day, more than 20 million barrels of oil move through those 2 miles. That is 1/5 of the entire world's daily supply. It is not just oil. A massive amount of liquefied natural gas passes through here too. The fuel that keeps the lights on in Tokyo, the factories running in Berlin, and the trucks moving in Los Angeles. It is the most important choke point on Earth. For decades, the world has lived with a simple assumption. The assumption is that as long as the United States Navy is there, the water stays open. We think of giant aircraft carriers. We think of billion-dollar destroyers with radar systems that can track a bird from 100 miles away. We think of power that cannot be challenged. But there is a different way to look at that narrow strip of water. If you are standing on the coast of Iran, you do not see a wide open ocean. You see a hallway that is crowded, shallow, and very easy to watch. For 30 years, the Iranian military has been studying that hallway. They know they cannot build a navy that looks like the American Navy. They do not have the money for aircraft carriers. They do not have the technology for stealth destroyers. So they decided to do something different. They decided to build a swarm. Instead of one giant ship that costs billions, they built thousands of small boats. Some are fast patrol boats. Some are tiny speedboats armed with heavy machine guns. Others are fitted with high-speed torpedoes or missiles that can skim across the surface of the water. They hide these boats in sea caves and hidden tunnels along their rocky coastline. They train their crews to move in packs. They do not want a fair fight. They want to overwhelm the senses of their enemy. They want to create a situation where there are more targets than there are bullets to hit them. This is the tension that sits under the surface of the water every single day. On one side, you have the most powerful high-tech fleet in human history. On the other side, you have thousands of cheap, fast, and deadly shadows, waiting for the order. For a long time, people argued about whether these fast boats could actually do anything. Experts said they were just toys. They said a modern destroyer would pick them off before they even saw the horizon. But as technology changed, the math started to shift. Missiles got smaller. Engines got faster. And the world got more dependent on that oil. The question stopped being if Iran would try. The question became what would happen if they succeeded. If those 2 miles of water were closed for even a single day, the global economy would begin to shake. If they were closed for a week, the world as we know it would start to break. This is not a story about a war that happened. It is a story about the war that almost happened and how close we are to it happening tomorrow. It starts with a single moment of tension that spirals out of control. It starts with a shadow in the water that the radar did not see. It was a Tuesday, just a normal, humid Tuesday in the middle of the Persian Gulf. The crew on a United States Navy destroyer was doing what they always do. They were watching. They were scanning the horizon and checking their radar screens for any sign of movement. In this part of the world, you are never truly alone. There is always a fishing boat, a massive oil tanker, or a small patrol craft somewhere nearby. For years, the sailors on these ships had grown used to a very specific kind of dance. They called it harassment. An Iranian speedboat would zip toward the American ship at high speed. It would get close enough for the sailors to see the faces of the people on the boat. Sometimes the Iranians would show off their weapons. Sometimes they would just wave. Then, at the last second, they would turn away and disappear. It was a game of nerves. The Americans would stay calm, keep their hands on their triggers, and wait for the boat to leave. It happened so often that it started to feel like routine. It became something you just put up with while you were on duty. But on this Tuesday, the routine broke. It started with one boat, then two, then 10. Usually, the Iranians would send out a small group of 3 or 4 boats to make a point. But this time, the radar operators saw something different. The screen did not just have a few dots. It was starting to look like a cloud. Every few minutes, more boats were appearing. They were coming out from behind the rocky islands that line the coast. They were launching from hidden docks inside sea caves. They were even coming out of commercial ports, mixing in with the regular traffic. On the bridge of the American destroyer, the mood changed instantly. This was not a game of nerves anymore. This was a massive, coordinated move. The commander looked at the screen and realized they were facing something they had practiced for, but never actually seen. They were facing a swarm. In the past, the plan was all you warn it. If it keeps coming, you shoot. But how do you warn 100 boats at the same time? How do you track them all when they are moving in different directions at 40 miles per hour? While the Americans were trying to figure out what was happening, the order was given on the other side. In a command center deep underground on the Iranian coast, a finger pressed a button. They did not send a radio message. They did not give a warning. They simply let the swarm loose. The goal was not to win a fair fight against the American ship. The goal was to create total chaos. The fast boats were not all the same. Some of them were just speedboats with 2 men and a heavy machine gun. Others were unmanned. They were essentially floating bombs, packed with explosives and controlled by a remote signal. They were programmed to find the biggest thing in the water and hit it. And then there were the missile boats. These were slightly larger, carrying 2 or 3 missiles that could fly just above the waves. They did not wait for the perfect shot, they just started firing. The American destroyer was one of the most advanced pieces of technology ever built. It had missiles that could intercept targets in space. It had a gun that could fire thousands of rounds a minute. But it was designed to fight other big ships. It was designed to find a few high-value targets and take them out from a distance. Now, it was surrounded by hundreds of tiny targets. The radar system was working perfectly, but it was overwhelmed. It was like trying to keep track of every single bee in a hive, while the hive is attacking you. The sailors on the deck could hear the roar of the engines getting louder. They could see the white foam of the wakes as the boats closed the distance. They were less than 2 miles away. In the world of modern naval combat, 2 miles is nothing. It is the blink of an eye. The commander of the destroyer had only a few seconds to make a choice. If he waited too long to defend his ship, he might lose it. If he opened fire first, he might be starting a global war. But as the first Iranian missile left its launcher and skipped across the water, the choice was made for him. The first explosion did not hit the destroyer. It hit a massive oil tanker that was sitting just a mile away. A wall of fire rose up into the sky, hundreds of feet tall. The black smoke began to cover the sun. The routine was over. The turning point had arrived, and the world was about to find out exactly how fragile those 2 miles of water really were. The smoke from the first tanker was just the beginning. In the first 60 minutes, the world changed. The Iranian fast boats did not just attack the warships. They went for the softest targets they could find. They went for the oil tankers. Imagine a ship as long as 3 football fields. It is filled with millions of gallons of flammable liquid. It moves slowly. It cannot turn quickly. It has no armor. It has no guns. To a fast boat carrying a high-speed torpedo or a missile, that tanker is a mountain that cannot hide. In the first hour, 7 different tankers were hit. Some of them were just damaged. Others were turned into massive pillars of fire. The crews on those ships had no training for this. They were merchant sailors, not soldiers. They were caught in a crossfire they could not survive. The radio channels were a mess. Every ship in the area was screaming for help at the same time. Distress signals were overlapping. The sounds of panic were being broadcast in 10 different languages. As the tankers burned, they started to drift. In a channel that is only 2 miles wide, a drifting, burning ship is a wall. It blocks everyone else. Other ships tried to turn around. They tried to run for the open ocean. But there was nowhere to go. The swarm was everywhere. The sky was filled with the sound of hundreds of engines and the roar of explosions. The American destroyer was firing everything it had. The automated guns were spinning and spitting fire. The missile launchers were working at their maximum speed. But for every boat they hit, 5 more seemed to take its place. The sailors on the destroyer were experiencing what military experts call the saturation threshold. It is the point where there are simply more incoming threats than there are systems to stop them. Even the most advanced radar in the world cannot track 100 different targets moving in 100 different directions at once. The system starts to prioritize. It ignores the small threats to focus on the big ones. But in this fight, every small threat was big enough to kill. The American Navy was trying to organize a defense, but there was no front line. The enemy was coming from every direction. They were coming from the front, the back, and the sides. They were even coming from the middle of the commercial traffic. This made it almost impossible for the Americans to use their long-range weapons. They could not fire a missile at a target if there was a neutral merchant ship in the way. The Iranians knew this. They used the oil tankers as shields. They hid in the radar shadows of the giant ships. They popped out, fired, and disappeared again. By the end of the first hour, the Strait of Hormuz was no longer a shipping lane. It had become what insurance companies call a total loss zone. This is a technical term for a place where the risk is so high that no one will enter it. The maritime insurance market in London did not wait for the sun to go down. They reacted within minutes. The cost to send a ship through the strait did not just go up. It became impossible to get insurance at any price. If a ship is not insured, it does not move. Every tanker that was already in the Gulf stopped where it was. They dropped anchor and waited. The heartbeat of the global energy market skipped a beat. The fire on the water was another problem. Burning oil was spreading across the surface of the strait. It created a thick, black fog that even thermal cameras struggled to see through. The smell of burning fuel and salt water filled the air for miles. On the bridge of the American destroyer, the crew realized they were in a fight for their lives. They were not just protecting the tankers anymore. They were trying to keep their own ship from being hit by a suicide boat. The speed of the attack was the most shocking part. In modern war, people expect things to happen fast. But this was faster than anyone had predicted. It was a literal wave of steel and fire. The world was watching the first hour of this conflict on their phones. Videos from the crews of the merchant ships were being uploaded in real time. People were seeing a billion-dollar navy being harassed by speedboats. The sense of safety that had existed for decades was gone in 60 minutes. The immediate consequence was fear. Not just the fear of the sailors in the water, but the fear of every person who depended on that oil. The fear of every government that realized their energy security was a myth. The first hour proved that the hallway could be closed. Now, the world had to figure out how to pay for it. While the ships are burning in the water, a different kind of fire is spreading across the world. It travels at the speed of light through fiber optic cables. It hits the newsrooms in London, the trading floors in New York, and the smartphones in your pocket. In the first few hours, the world does not know exactly who is winning the battle, but they know one thing for certain. The heartbeat has stopped. The oil markets do not wait for a formal report. They do not wait to see if the American Navy can clear the channel. Traders see the videos of burning tankers and they panic. The price of a barrel of oil does not just go up by a few dollars. It begins to climb so fast that the digital boards can barely keep up. Before the sun sets on that first day, the price of oil has doubled. This is what economists call the Hormuz premium. It is a fancy name for a very simple thing. It is the price of fear. When people are afraid that the oil will stop flowing tomorrow, they try to buy all of it today. But for you, this fear does not stay on a computer screen. It shows up at the corner gas station. Imagine you are driving home from work. You see a line of cars stretching out into the street. People are not just filling their tanks. They are filling plastic jugs and metal cans. The numbers on the big sign at the station are changing while you watch. In some cities, the price of gas goes from $3 to $6 in a single afternoon. By the second day, the signs change again. They do not show a price anymore. They just say out of order. This is when the real shock begins to settle in. Most of us think of oil as something we put in our cars. But our entire world is built on the back of cheap energy. Think about the grocery store. The milk, the bread, and the fruit did not grow in the back room. They were brought there by a truck. That truck runs on diesel. If the price of diesel triples, the price of a loaf of bread has to go up too. If the trucks stop moving because they cannot find fuel, the shelves start to go empty. In the boardrooms of the world's biggest companies, the math is becoming terrifying. A factory in Germany that makes car parts suddenly finds that its electricity bill has tripled. An airline in Japan realizes it will lose money on every single flight it takes. The global economy is like a giant machine that has been built to run at a specific speed. When you take away 20% of its fuel, the gears start to grind against each other. The stock market begins to crash. Trillions of dollars of wealth disappear in 48 hours. Governments around the world realize they are facing a crisis they cannot solve with a speech. They cannot just print more oil. They have to get those 2 miles of water open. But as the days pass and the swarm continues to hold the strait, the pressure builds. Nations that are usually friends start to argue over who gets the remaining oil. Countries that have their own reserves stop exporting them to protect their own people. The world is not just getting more expensive, it is getting more divided. And it is all happening because of a few hundred small boats in a narrow hallway. The economic shock is a weapon that hits every person on Earth at the same time. It does not matter if you live in a city or a small village. It does not matter if you care about the military or not. You are now a part of the conflict. And as the lights begin to flicker in cities that have never known a blackout, the world looks toward the Persian Gulf. They are waiting to see if the giant can find a way to swat the flies. The aircraft carrier is the most powerful weapon ever built by human beings. It is a floating city made of steel. It carries 80 fighter jets. It is surrounded by destroyers and cruisers that are designed to be its shield. But as the carrier strike group moves toward the center of the conflict, has ever truly solved. It is a problem of math. Every destroyer has a certain number of missiles in its vertical launching system. Let's say a ship has 90 cells. That means it can fire 90 missiles before it has to stop, before it has to leave the fight, before it has to find a safe port to reload. But the swarm does not have 90 boats. The swarm has hundreds. And the swarm is not coming all at once in a straight line. They are coming in waves. The first wave is not meant to kill the carrier. The first wave is meant to make the carrier use up its ammunition. Imagine you are a sailor sitting in the dark room of a destroyer. You are watching a screen that shows the Aegis combat system. This is the most advanced computer in the world. It can track hundreds of targets at the same time. It can tell the difference between a bird and a missile. But the screen is now completely white. There are so many tiny dots moving at high speed that the computer is struggling to tell them apart. Is that dot a fishing boat? Is it a suicide drone? Is it a fast boat carrying a torpedo? You have to make a choice. If you don't fire, and that boat is a bomb, the ship dies. If you do fire, you have one less missile for the next wave. And the next wave is already on its way. This is the saturation threshold. It is the moment when the defense simply runs out of things to throw at the enemy. The missiles the Americans are using cost $2 million each. The boats they are hitting cost $50,000. The Iranians are trading cheap wood and fiberglass for million-dollar pieces of high-tech machinery. They are winning the war of the wallet before the battle is even over. The noise inside the American ships is deafening. The 5-inch guns on the deck are firing so fast that the barrels are turning red. The sailors are working in high heat, trying to keep the machines from jamming. Outside, the water is a graveyard of burning engines and sinking hulls. But for every 10 boats that explode, one gets through. One boat manages to hide in the smoke of its friends. One boat stays low to the waves, slipping under the radar. It is only a few hundred yards away now. From the deck of the carrier, you can hear the sound of its engine. It sounds like a lawnmower. But that lawnmower is carrying 500 pounds of high explosives. The carrier is turning. It is trying to move its massive bulk away from the threat. But it is like a whale trying to outrun a shark in a bathtub. There is no room to move. The water is too shallow. The tankers are in the way. The defense is working. The shield is holding. But the shield is getting thinner with every passing minute. The sailors know the math. They know how many missiles are left in the tubes. And they know that the sun is starting to go down. In the dark, the swarm becomes even harder to see. In the dark, the radar gets even more confused. The giant is still standing, but the flies are starting to land. An aircraft carrier is a giant, but even giants have to eat. We often think of a carrier strike group as a collection of weapons. We see the fighter jets, the missiles, and the radar. But there is another part of the fleet that is just important. It is the invisible machine that keeps the giant alive. A carrier carries thousands of people. They need food. They need fresh water. They need thousands of gallons of jet fuel every single day just to keep the planes in the air. The Navy does not keep all of those supplies on the carrier itself. There isn't enough room. Instead, they bring it in on ships that look like massive oil tankers or giant container ships. In the military, these are called logistics ships. These ships are the unsung heroes of any fleet. They are also the weakest link in the entire chain. In military strategy, there is a concept called the logistics kill. It is a very simple idea. You do not have to sink the billion-dollar aircraft carrier to win the battle. You just have to sink the ship that carries its fuel and its food. If the carrier runs out of jet fuel, the planes cannot fly. If the planes cannot fly, the carrier is just a very expensive target sitting in the water. On the third day of the conflict in the Strait of Hormuz, the Iranian command makes a sharp change in strategy. They realize that their fast boats are being shredded by the destroyer's guns. They are losing hundreds of men and boats, and they haven't even scratched the hull of the carrier. So they stop looking at the warships. They start looking for the delivery trucks. They find a massive supply ship moving through the outer edges of the fleet. Let's call it the Alan Shepard. It is as long as 2 football fields. It is carrying tons of ammunition, spare parts for the F-35 jets, and millions of gallons of fuel. The Alan Shepard is not a warship. It is manned by civilian sailors who work for the Navy. It has a few small guns for defense, but it does not have the heavy armor or the advanced missile shields of a destroyer. To the fast boat swarm, this ship is the perfect target. The boats begin to move in. They do not approach from the front where the guns are strongest. They come from the back and the sides. They move in small groups of 5 or 6. The destroyers that are supposed to protect the Alan Shepard are already busy. They are miles away, fighting off a wave of suicide drones and missiles being fired from the Iranian coastline. Their radar screens are full. Their crews are exhausted. The swarm sees the gap in the defense. They pour through it like water, through a broken dam. On the bridge of the Alan Shepard, the captain sees the dots on his screen. He knows. His ship cannot outrun a fast boat. He knows his small crew cannot fight off 100 targets at once. He calls for help, but the radio is filled with the sounds of other ships in trouble. The first hit is a high-speed torpedo fired from a boat hiding in the smoke of a burning tanker. It slams into the hull near the fuel tanks. The ship does not blow up immediately, but the engines stop. The power goes out. Now, the giant is paralyzed. Within minutes, dozens of small boats are swarming around the hull of the Alan Shepard. They are firing machine guns and shoulder-fired missiles. They aren't trying to sink it with one big blow. They are cutting it with 1,000 tiny wounds. This is the nightmare scenario for a modern navy. If you lose your supply ships, your carrier is on a very short timer. It can only stay in the fight for a few more days before its magazines are empty and its fuel tanks are dry. The sailors will soon be hungry. The machines will soon be still. The commander of the strike group now has to make an impossible choice. Does he pull his destroyers away from the carrier to go and save the remaining supply ships? If he does that, the carrier is vulnerable to a missile attack. Or does he keep his destroyers close to protect the carrier and watch his lifeline burn on the horizon? The Iranians are forcing the most powerful navy in the world to play a defensive game. They are making the masters of the ocean worry about a delivery truck. This is the true power of the swarm. It doesn't have to be stronger than you. It just has to be smarter about where it hits. As the Alan Shepard begins to tilt to one side and thick black smoke rises from its deck, the message is clear. The swarm has found the heartbeat of the fleet. For the sailors on the aircraft carrier, watching that smoke is a terrifying sight. It means their fuel is gone. It means their food is gone. It means the clock is ticking. And in a war of attrition, the clock is the most dangerous weapon of all. The swarm was just the beginning. It was the noise meant to distract you. While the destroyers were busy shooting at speedboats, a second threat was already in the water. It was silent. It was patient. It was the sea mine. The record shows that for weeks before the first shot was fired, hundreds of these mines were dropped into the shipping lanes. They are not the big, rusty balls with spikes that you see in old movies. Modern mines are smart. They sit on the bottom of the ocean, and they listen. They wait for the specific sound of a large ship's engine. They wait for the magnetic pull of a steel hull. When a mine goes off under a ship, it does not just poke a small hole. It creates a giant bubble of air that lifts the entire ship up and then lets it drop. The weight of the ship itself breaks its own back. Now, the American Navy has a new problem. They cannot just sail through the strait to clear the boats. They have to move slowly. They have to send out specialized ships to find the mines. But those mine-hunting ships are slow and they have very little armor. And the swarm is still out there waiting for them. This is the first link in the chain reaction. But there is a third layer to this trap. It is sitting on the shore. Hidden in the Rocky Mountains and tucked into the trees along the coast are mobile missile launchers. These are just trucks. They can drive out of a garage, fire a missile, and hide again before anyone can hit back. The Iranians have thousands of them. These missiles are designed to hit ships from the land. They are fast. They fly just a few feet above the waves. And they are coming from everywhere. It is not just one missile. It is dozens of them, fired in a coordinated strike. The destroyers are now being attacked from the sea by the boats and from the land by the missiles. This is the chain reaction in full effect. One threat makes you vulnerable to the next. If you look down at the water to find the mines, you forget to look at the sky for the missiles. If you look at the sky for the missiles, you forget to watch the horizon for the boats. The Strait of Hormuz is no longer a waterway. It has become a kill zone. The Americans realize that they cannot just fight their way through. Every step forward is a risk they might not survive. If a single destroyer is hit by a land-based missile, the mission changes instantly. The Navy is no longer trying to protect oil tankers. They are trying to save their own sailors, and while they are busy saving themselves, the strait stays closed. The chain reaction has turned a local fight into a total lockdown. The world is watching, and they are realizing that the old rules do not apply anymore. The giant fleet is being held back by a series of traps that cost almost nothing. The pressure is moving from the water to the land. And on land, the consequences are about to get even worse. This is the moment where the political pressure becomes unbearable. Nations that were staying neutral are forced to take a side. They need that oil to keep their people from freezing or starving. They start to demand that the fighting stops, no matter who wins. But the fighting cannot stop because the chain reaction has its own momentum now. The mines are still there. The missiles are still hidden. The swarm is still hunting. The heartbeat of the world is flatlining. 30 days have passed. The world is different now. The Strait of Hormuz is still closed. The smoke is cleared from the water, but the silence that replaced it is much louder. In the beginning, we thought this was a temporary problem. We thought the Navy would clear. The path and life would go back to normal. But that didn't happen. Every time a ship tries to enter the channel, it hits a mine. It hits a mine or is chased away by a swarm of boats. The world has realized that those 2 miles of water are now a wall. And because that wall exists, the global machine is breaking down. Think about how we used to live. If you wanted a new phone, it was shipped from halfway across the world. If you wanted fresh fruit in the winter, it was flown in from another continent. All of that depended on cheap fuel. It depended on the belief that the ships would never stop moving. Now, that belief is gone. The cost of moving anything is 10 times what it used to be. The just-in-time world has vanished. In the old world, a factory only kept enough parts for one day of work. They trusted that the next truck would arrive on time. Now, those factories are empty. Millions of people have been sent home because there are no parts to put together. The cars aren't being built. The computers aren't being made. The giant shipping companies have given up on the Persian Gulf entirely. They are looking for new ways to get things from point A to point B. Some are trying to go around the bottom of Africa. That adds thousands of miles to every trip. It adds weeks to the delivery time. And it uses even more of the fuel that we no longer have. But the biggest change isn't in the factories or the shipping lanes. The biggest change is in our own homes. In cities that used to be bright all night, the lights are now turned off. Governments have started rationing power. They tell you when you can use your stove. They tell you when you can charge your car. The era of endless energy has ended. People are starting to look at their own neighborhoods differently. If you cannot get food from across the ocean, you have to find it nearby. Farmers who were struggling for years are suddenly the most important people in the country. Local gardens are appearing in city parks. The global village is shrinking back into thousands of small, isolated towns. We are seeing the rise of a new kind of power. It isn't about who has the biggest aircraft carrier anymore. It is about who can survive without the rest of the world. Countries that have their own coal, their own wind, or their own sun are the new leaders. Countries that relied entirely on trade are falling apart. Social unrest is growing. In the streets of major cities, people are angry. They are angry that their lives were built on such a fragile foundation. They are angry that a few hundred small boats could take away their way of life. The international alliances we thought were permanent are starting to crack. Friends are fighting over the last shipments of fuel. Everyone is looking out for themselves. The world is not just getting more expensive, it is getting more divided. And it is all happening because of a few hundred small boats in a narrow hallway. The economic shock is a weapon that hits every person on Earth at the same time. It does not matter if you live in a city or a small village. It does not matter if you care about the military or not. You are now a part of the conflict. And as the lights begin to flicker in cities that have never known a blackout, the world looks toward the Persian Gulf. They are waiting to see if the giant can find a way to swat the flies. The silence in the Strait of Hormuz has echoed into every corner of the earth. It has forced us to look in the mirror, and we don't like what we see. We see how much we gave up just to have things slightly cheaper and slightly faster. The giant has not just been stung, the giant has been grounded. And now, the long shadow of this conflict is starting to stretch across the next century. The world waited for the Navy to fix it. They waited for the announcement that the water was safe again. But after 2 months, that announcement never came. The Navy was still there, but they were playing a game of whack-a-mole they could not win. Nations finally realized that the old energy map was gone forever. If you cannot go through the main door, you have to find a window. The first window was the pipelines. There are massive steel pipes that run across the land in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. They were built specifically for a moment like this. They carry oil from the fields directly to the Red Sea or the Gulf of Oman. By going across the desert, they avoid the Strait of Hormuz entirely. But there was a massive problem that the planners had ignored. The pipelines were never designed to carry everything. They could only move about 5 million barrels of oil a day. The world needed 20 million just to keep the lights on and the trucks moving. It was like trying to empty a swimming pool with a single drinking straw. And the pipelines were not safe from the chaos either. The same drones and missiles that were hitting ships were now being aimed at the pumping stations in the desert. A single hit on a station could stop the flow for weeks. The world realized that the energy pivot had to go deeper than just finding a different path for the oil. It had to be a pivot away from the oil itself. For decades, people talked about green energy as a way to save the environment. Now, they talked about it as the only way to save their country. The conversation shifted from climate change to national survival. Every wind turbine built on a windy coast became a tiny fortress. Every solar farm in the desert became a source of national security. If the wind is blowing in your own backyard, No one in a fast boat can stop you from using it. Nuclear power plants that were scheduled to be closed were suddenly being kept open at all costs. New reactors were being planned and approved in record time. Governments stopped asking how much it would cost to build them. They only asked how fast the concrete could be poured. The pivot was not just about how we made power. It was about how we moved it and how we used it. Electric cars went from being a luxury for the rich to being a necessity for the worker. If you could not find gas at the corner station, you needed a way to get to work that did not involve a tanker. The demand for batteries grew so fast that it created a new kind of global gold rush. The world started looking at the map of minerals the same way they used to look at the map of oil fields. Nations began to scramble for lithium, cobalt, and copper. We were trading our dependence on one part of the world for a dependence on another. But there was one big difference that changed the math. A battery can be charged and reused thousands of times. Oil is gone forever, the moment you burn it. This change was painful for everyone. It was expensive for the taxpayers. It was messy for the politicians. But it was happening at a speed that no one thought was possible. What should have taken 50 years was happening in less than 5. The crisis in the Strait of Hormuz acted like a giant mirror. It showed every nation exactly where they were weak and where they were vulnerable. It showed them that being dependent on a single 2-mile stretch of water was a form of collective madness. The energy pivot changed the way our cities were built. They became more compact because moving things long distances was too expensive. Public transit systems that had been ignored for years were suddenly full of people. People started working from home not because of a health crisis, but because they could not afford the drive. The massive, globalized world was being replaced by a series of local power grids. The era of the super system was over. Nations were learning to stand on their own 2 feet out of sheer necessity. The oil was still there, sitting under the sand in the Middle East. But its power to hold the world hostage was fading with every new solar panel and every new battery. The fast boats had successfully closed the strait, but in doing so, they had accidentally forced the world to find a way to live without it. The pivot was a sign that the giant was finally waking up to a new reality. It was a world where energy was no longer a commodity you bought from a stranger across the sea. It was something you captured for yourself. And once that door of independence was opened, it could never be closed again. The long-term winner of the Battle of Hormuz was not the Navy or the swarm. It was the sun, the wind, and the atom. For decades, the world believed in the power of the supership. We thought that if you had a ship that cost $13 billion, you owned the ocean. We thought that a single aircraft carrier was enough to keep an entire region in line. But the battle in the Strait of Hormuz changed that belief forever. It was the end of an era. Military leaders around the world were watching what happened in those narrow waters. They saw the most advanced navy on Earth being forced to retreat. They saw a billion-dollar destroyer being harassed by a boat made of wood and fiberglass. And they realized that in shallow water, the rules of power had flipped. Before this, every country wanted to be like the United States. They wanted to build their own carriers. They wanted big, beautiful ships that could sail across the globe. But after the swarm, the world stopped looking for the biggest ship. They started looking for the most effective way to protect their own coast. The geopolitical map of the world began to shift. Smaller nations realized they didn't need to compete with a superpower on its own terms. They didn't need to spend their entire national budget on a single ship. They just needed 1,000 small ones. They needed drones, they needed fast boats, they needed hidden missile launchers. This is what experts call anti-access or area denial. But for the rest of us, it is a very simple idea. It is the idea that you can make it too expensive for a giant to walk into your yard. China was watching this more closely than anyone. For years, they had been worried about how to protect their own shipping lanes in the South China Sea. They saw what happened in Hormuz, and they took notes. They realized that the carrier was no longer the queen of the chessboard in coastal waters. It was too big of a target, it was too hard to hide, and it was too expensive to lose. If you lose a carrier, you lose the morale of your entire country. If you lose a fast boat, you just launch another one. This realization changed the way navies are designed. The age of the supership was being replaced by the age of the cloud fleet. Instead of putting all of your power into one giant hull, you spread it out. You put your missiles on 100 different, small, unmanned platforms. You make your navy look like a swarm of bees instead of a single eagle. This shift meant that the oceans were becoming a lot more crowded and a lot more dangerous. The United States Navy had to rethink its entire mission. They realized they could no longer just park a carrier off a coast and expect everyone to stay quiet. They had to learn how to fight in the shadows. They had to learn how to use their own swarms, but the most important change was political. The idea of command of the sea was dying. In the 20th century, one country could truly control the oceans. In the 21st century, the ocean was becoming a series of local zones. The superpower could still travel across the deep blue water of the middle of the ocean, but when they got close to land, they were entering the territory of the swarm. This meant that the world was becoming more divided. Regional powers were becoming more confident. They knew they had a weapon that could hold a giant at bay. The balance of power was no longer about who had the most money. It was about who had the most targets. The long-term shadow of the battle was a world where no one was truly in charge of the water. It was a world where the hallway could be closed by anyone with enough speedboats and enough patience. The giant was not dead, but it was no longer the only thing in the room. And for the first time in 100 years, the giant was afraid of the small. The conflict in the Strait of Hormuz was not just a month of fighting. It was a crack in the foundation of the modern world that never truly healed. If you look at a map of the world 50 years after the swarm, it looks different than the one we grew up with. The giant blue lines that used to connect every continent have been broken into smaller, tighter loops. We call this the era of the Great Regionalization. Before the swarm, we believed the ocean was a neutral highway that belonged to everyone. We believed that a factory in Ohio could depend on a part made in Vietnam, which depended on a mineral from Africa. We called it a global supply chain. But the swarm proved that a global supply chain is only as strong as its narrowest point, and the world decided that it was too dangerous to be that vulnerable ever again. Trade did not stop, but it changed its shape. Nations began to trade with their neighbors. Instead of looking across the sea, they traded security for speed. They traded lower prices for the peace of mind that their supplies would actually arrive. The massive container ships that used to be the kings of the ocean started to disappear. They were replaced by smaller, faster fleets that stayed closer to home. The map of global wealth shifted away from the coasts and back toward the heart of the continents. The big port cities that had dominated the world for 500 years began to lose their power. If you could move goods by train or truck across land, you did. The great iron silk roads of the 21st century were built across Asia and Europe. These were not just tracks in the dirt. They were massive high-speed networks that could move millions of tons of goods without ever touching the water. The ocean became a place for the bold and the heavily armed. Maritime insurance never returned to the low prices of the early 2000s. Sending a ship across the open ocean became a luxury. It was something you only did for things that could not be found anywhere else. The average person noticed this change in their own home. Things became more expensive, but they were built to last longer. The throwaway culture of the past could not survive in a world where shipping was a risk. We went from a world of more to a world of enough. The political map changed too. The era of the single superpower was replaced by a handful of regional blocks. Each block had its own energy, its own food, and its own defense. They were like walled gardens. They were safe inside, but they were suspicious of everyone outside. The United Nations and other global groups lost their influence because they could no longer guarantee the safety of trade. In this new world, power was not about who had the most gold in a bank. It was about who had the most physical control over their own borders. The Hormuz shadow is what historians call the persistent fear that any narrow waterway could be closed at any moment. Other choke points like the Suez Canal or the Strait of Malacca were watched with constant anxiety. Every nation built its own version of the swarm to protect its own front door. The ocean was no longer a highway. It was a series of heavily guarded gates. We realized that the peak of globalization was a beautiful accident of history. It was a moment when we all agreed to trust each other because we thought it was more profitable than fighting. The fast boats in the Strait of Hormuz ended that trust. They reminded us that geography still matters. They reminded us that a few miles of water can still bring a giant to its knees. 50 years later, we are more self-reliant, but we are also more isolated. We are safer in our own neighborhoods, but we are more afraid of the horizon. The shadow of the swarm is still there, cast across every wave in the sea. It is a reminder that the world we built was much more fragile than we wanted to admit, and that once a heartbeat stops, you can never quite get the rhythm back to exactly the way it was before. The first lesson is about the math of modern war. For a long time, we thought that the side with the most expensive machines would always win. We thought that a ship costing billions of dollars was untouchable, but the swarm proved that 1,000 cheap tools can beat one expensive one. If it costs you $2 million to stop a $50,000 boat, you are losing the war even if you never miss a shot. The side that can afford to lose more usually wins in the end. The second lesson is that geography is not dead. We lived in a world where we thought distance and narrow hallways did not matter anymore. We thought technology had made the world flat. But the Strait of Hormuz showed us that a few miles of water can still control the fate of 8 billion people. The maps we draw in school are not just lines, they are the boundaries of our survival. The third lesson is about the danger of being too efficient. We built a world that was perfect as long as nothing went wrong. We removed all the extra supplies and all the backup plans to save money, but when the heartbeat stopped, we had nothing to fall back on. Resilience is more important than efficiency when the world is on fire. It is better to have a little bit of what you need nearby than to have everything you want 1,000 miles away. The final lesson is about the fragility of trust. The global economy only works because we all agree to follow certain rules. We trust that the ships will move and the lights will stay on. But once that trust is broken, it takes decades to rebuild. The swarm did more than just sink ships. It sank the idea that we are all in this together. This is a hypothetical scenario based on the historical record. Real outcomes would depend on factors no model can predict.